Hello and welcome to our presentation on experiential learning. My name is Michael Padovani and I'll be presenting this project done by Noel Schwegwell, Diana Robert Torres, and Michael Padovani for the INTC 5410 class at Richard Stockton University of New Jersey. Now, experiential learning is required to be looked at because we need to look at the experiential theorists who helped to cultivate the entire project. The first is John Dewey, born 1859 and died 1952. He was a pragmatist, philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer who interacted with the environment in order to adapt and learn, and he believed that the student should be the center of the teaching and learning process. The next person up is Kurt Lewin, born 1890, died 1947, who is a Gestalt psychologist and the pioneer of social organization in the applied psychology. And he believed that knowledge is gained through action and for action. He was big into field theory, action research, and group dynamics. Up next is Jean Piaget, born 1896, died 1980, who is a clinical psychologist who believed in the cognitive developmental theory. He believed that autonomy rather than social interdependency as the means of creating new knowledge was the key, and that pedagogy should be matched to the stages of various types of development. Up next is Malcolm Knowles, born 1913, died 1997. He was an adult educator. He distinguished pedagogic, which is the child way of learning, from the andragogic, which is the adult way of learning. He influenced the development of humanist learning theory and learner-constructed plans to guide learning experiences as a whole. But the granddaddy of them all is David A. Kolb, who is the main driving force behind this theory. He was an educational theorist who believed that one learned from experience and only from experience, and that the individual and social processes were key to actually doing a full-on way of learning. Now, Kolb itself believed that there were different types of experiential educators, the first of which was the facilitator, who provided the way of learning. Then you have the coaches, who continue to coach and mentor, the subject expert, who focused primarily on one exact type of subject, and the standard setter and evaluator, who themselves were the people who looked at things as a whole. Now, there are 4 stages of experiential learning: the activity stage, which is what happened, the facts; the reflection, which is the feelings, what did I experience; the conceptualization of why did that happen, which are the findings; and finally the application of what do I do next, which looks into the future of how one takes what they've learned and applying it in a completely different way. So the first of these is the activity stage, which results in participating in an activity and doing experimentation, having an experience. Without the experience, you couldn't well have experiential learning, now could you? And this itself is key to how one actually learns from this, because with the activity itself comes the reflection, because you would review the experience as a whole. You'd look at the successes and failures of how everything turned out, or the impacts, and has your viewpoint changed at all from when you began. So this itself is key when looking at how a learning style is done, because you have to look at what you've done before you can move on. Moving on, we have the abstract conceptualization, which is taking everything that you're reflecting about and then putting it together and realize as a whole what's going on, that aha moment, if you will. We are putting all the pieces together and taking the findings from your experience and figuring out what it is that you've actually learned as the entire process has concluded. And finally, you have the application, which is where you take the knowledge that you've gained and applying it in new ways. You're creating new ideas, you're examining future goals, and you're beginning new projects based entirely around the various things that you've learned as a process and result of this learning as a whole. So the application itself is very important. However, there are different actual things and issues with the style as a whole. In fact, there are 2 major criticisms for experiential learning. These are the validity of the LSI, which we'll go over in the next slide, and theoretical limitations of the concept itself and how it actually is not looking at things as a whole. Now, the LSI itself, looking at this giant thing on the top, is actually a learning style inventory, which puts learners into one of 4 experiential types of learning. Now, if we look at the top, you have the various different things we've gone over before: reflection, abstract, action. But this itself breaks it down even more with accommodating, diverging, and converging, and assimilating. These itself, not everyone will fall into these same 4 learning styles. So people like Kolb are not actually looking at how everybody is learning. It requires them to actually create more than 4 different learning styles. And it's going to require a complete overhaul of how experiential learning is looked at, which is probably not going to happen. The next one is the theoretical limitations. So the style itself does not reflect on how certain aspects of life could affect how one perceives learning. Different people learn in different ways. This is true. But there are other things besides learning styles that affect how a person can learn. How does one get their learning style? Well, the first of these is social limitations. Experiential learning process is unfair when looking at those from different social backgrounds who may or may not have the ability or access to things that people could provide for them. The poor do not have the same opportunities as the wealthy, and the wealthy will never know how the poor itself works because they're given so much more. Following this, you have gender limitations. Men and women, regardless of how people think, have different issues when it comes to learning because in the classroom they're not given the same chances. Same with the actual, work environment. And this itself extends even more to people who identify with different genders than the ones that they're born with. Then there are cultural limitations. The final limitation is presented through the cultural struggles. If adapting to a new culture by coming from a background where different customs and learning styles apply, the theory cannot accurately reflect the true type of learners one can be because they're not taking how a person in China might be different than a person in Australia or even America. So in conclusion, experiential learning is a great, great way of learning, but its downfall comes to the price of almost being exclusively focused on the individualized perspectives without looking at how other influences might otherwise affect the learning style. It's true that one does learn from experience, but there's more to be looked at. I'm Michael Padovani, and thank you.